Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, 2 more stories from the Pentamerone. Just short ones this time. The first one is The Three Faeries. Let's start with Burton's faux Jacobean. Cecilia, ill-treated by her stepmother, is well entreated by 3 fairies. Her envious stepmother sendeth her own daughter to them, and she is scorned by them, for which reason she sendeth her stepdaughter to watch pigs. A great lord hath fallen in love with her, but through craft and wickedness, by the stepmother, they give him the ugly daughter in exchange, and she putteth her stepdaughter in a cask, ready to pour boiling water upon her. The lord discovereth the treachery, taketh out Cecilia, and putteth the hideous daughter in her place, and the mother cometh and scaldeth her with boiling water, and finding out her error, slayeth herself. The thing is, this one's so brief, there's not a lot that Burton's missed. He goes on for an entire paragraph about how ugly the stepdaughter is, for example, which is as boring as anything if you aren't the sort of person to laugh in mockery of the appearance of others. It was a big seller in medieval Venice, apparently, but now it's about as funny as a Scooby-Doo multi-door chase scene. Burton says she's the image of a sea ghouler, which is a tribe I've not heard of before, but presumably it relates to the desert ghouls we have often discussed. The stepdaughter needs to do all the household chores, and one day, while she's out carrying something home, she drops a basket in a ravine. She's thinking of ways to retrieve it when a sorcerer appears behind her, who seems to be a ghouler. I'll include his description, as he might make a useful monster. I presume he's what we would call an ogre. In this story, he seems to at first be behind her and then to be down in the ravine, otherwise the dialogue makes little sense. His hair stood up like a hog's bristles, black and stiff, sinking to the very marrow of the bones. The forehead was full of wrinkles, so that it seemed furrowed by the plough. He had shaggy brows, crooked eyes sunk deeply into the orbits and filled with, what do you call it? And they looked like shops under the eyelashes' heavy gutter. He had a crooked, frothing mouth, out of which protruded a pair of tusks like a wild boar's. His breast was full of bumps, and covered with hair enough to stuff a mattress, and above all he was hunchbacked, round-bellied, and had thin legs and crooked feet. His appearance was such as it would make you twist your mouth with fear. Cecilia, however, isn't afraid, and asks him to hand up the basket, with the blessing, "May you be married to a rich spouse." He answers, "Come down, O daughter, and take it up." Cecilia climbs down, clutching at roots and stones, and I note in doing this she has, in Ars Magica terms, taken the role of daughter when it was offered. When she arrives at the bottom, she's met by 3 fairies, who are, according to Burton's description, blonde and exceedingly lovely. They kiss and caress her and lead her to a house under the rubbish where the king dwells. Personally, I'm hoping for Oscar the Grouch, but I'm sure to be disappointed. She combs and braids the fairy's hair, and is asked what she finds afterwards, and she says there's a mixture of knits, lice, pearls, and garnets, and they're pleased, and they give her a tour of the palace. The luxuries described are weird to a modern reader, but they tell us a little about what impressed nobles at the time, so these materials may suit magic items. There are Turkish carpets, engraved desks, leather-covered caskets with brass corners, walnut tables so bright you can see your reflection in them, table covers of green fabric, adorned with flowers, and high-backed chairs covered in horse leather. In the wardrobe there are clothes made with sleeves of velvet and cloth of gold, and the bed covers are made of damask and taffeta. There are also charms shaped like a serpent's tongue or a crescent. There are also gems the shape of an ear of wheat, lilies, and feathers to wear, and garnet jewellery. The fairies tell Cecilia to take whatever she likes. She is humble, so she just takes an old skirt. They then ask her by which gate she'll leave, and she says she'll go by the stable door, and they bless her with a wand and curse the circumstances which left her in the wood. And then she heads home. On the way home, she crosses paths with a young lord named Cosimo, and he offers to marry her and have a word with the stepmother. He offers to grant Cecilia 100,000 ducats. The stepmother wants to swap the daughters, so she plays for time and sends him away, saying she needs to call her relatives and to take counsel. He agrees and heads off. The stepmother then forces Cecilia into a pickling barrel, and her plan is to pour hot water in and kill her. Cosimo arrives early because he's impatient, and he finds the stepdaughter in Cecilia's clothes. He is fooled, despite her being so disgusting the author can list negative characteristics for pages. His lands are far away, so he stops on the way home, and the first night they avoid each other because he's disgusted, and the next morning he takes her back to her stepmother's house to just call the whole thing off, and the stepmother isn't at home because she's off gathering wood to boil Cecilia alive. He declaims dramatically, as is usual in these stories, and a cat answers him, "Your wife's in the cask." He grabs the fire axe and smashes the barrel open, and stands there literally stunned by the beauty for a paragraph, and then he asks her who put her in the barrel, not once but 6 times in different ways. Elegant variation is beginning to wear me down in the Pentamerone. Cecilia explains what a pig pickling barrel is, and how murder is afoot. He gets her to dress and hide behind the door, then rebuilds the barrel in a display of practical coopering, which I didn't expect from a nobleman, and tricks the stepsister into the cask, saying he's having a protective charm made to preserve her from the evil eye. He then sneaks off with Cecilia, and they ride to Pasquarolo, north of Naples, where his lands are. The stepmother then returns home and murders her daughter. We'll not go into detail, save that she dies as if she had eaten Sardinian grass, which we've discussed before. The mother discovers her error and is so distressed she throws herself into a well and breaks her neck. The moral is, who spitteth to heaven, on his face receiveth the spittle. The two brothers. Let's kick off with Burton's Faux Jacobean. We need it because this is one of the least useful stories in this group, but I haven't excluded it as I have 3 others on the basis of their contents. Mercutio and Piermo are brothers, one rich and corrupt and vicious, and the other poor but virtuous, and they meet various vicissitudes, but the poor brother is driven away by the other, and after a time the rich brother falleth into poverty, and is driven near the gibbet, but at last is recognised to be innocent, and is saved by his brother, who hath become rich and a baron, and who giveth him a share of his good fortune. There's a merchant, he has 2 sons, he's dying, he calls them in, and he says, "Mercutio and Piermo, I'm about to die, so I've only got a little time to give you my final wisdom. Let me tell you how little time I have for a couple of paragraphs." His advice is kind of basic for a last word, but, who am I to judge? I thought it would be something like the treasure is in the cave behind the rock that shines on New Year's Day, but no, his advice is, wisdom is a treasure that can't be stolen, and he says that 3 ways. Fear heaven, which he says in 2 ways, and don't be lazy, which he says in 5 ways. Be frugal, he says by small coins is made the ducat, which seems like a very early version of take care of the pennies and the pounds will look after themselves. Spend as much as you can, eat as much as you want, drink as much as you like. People with money are good, people without money are bad, hobgoblins and asses. Suck up to the rich. This is where sleep with dogs, arise with fleas come from. It's also the source of the ablest saw about not having friends who are lame. Don't talk much. Be happy to have little. Think first, act later. This is where don't shut the stable door once the oxen are gone comes from, and that changes a bit in the modern version about bolting horses. He says this in another way later. Chew well, then swallow. Avoid quarrels, avoid pride, the gibbet is for fools. Avoid redheads. This, I note, may be an anti-Semitism thing. The love of the great is like flask wine, good in the morning, sour in the evening. Time for a quote. Take care of a rich man become poor, of a peasant become rich, of a beggar in despair, of a petted servant, of an ignorant prince, or a mercenary judge, or a jealous woman, or a man of tomorrow, of a court flintstone, of a beardless man, of a woman with a beard, of a quiet river, of a smoky chimney, of bad neighbours, of a child that always weepeth, and of an envious man. The boys split up, and one is good and wise, but poor, and the other is a rake and becomes rich. Eventually, the poor brother asks the rich one for help and is refused. He decides to kill himself by climbing to the tallest available mountain and throwing himself to his death. Just before he manages it, a woman appears and catches him by the arm. She's gorgeous, dressed in green, and has a laurel wreath in her golden hair. She says, "My dude, you've studied so much, go use the weapons you've tempered. Let me say it again in 3 different ways. Virtue is a compass. Also, I'm virtue, and you seem to be blaming me for your problems, so heaven sent me here so I could tell you to suck it up and stop cursing my name. Shake it off, you big baby. I'm awesome." She then gives him a packet of powder and sends him to a particular town called Campo Largo. Oddly, it says he knows she's virtue by the point of her nose. He tries to kiss her feet, but she disappears because that's not her kink. He then slides down the mountain with the strong-willed virtue. She can apparently grant most of the personal virtues, but only turns up when heaven decides. In the town, there's a princess on her deathbed, and Mercutio says, "I can cure her if you like," and the king is happy to let him have a go. Let's take a quote. "He brought him to the chamber of the princess, where he found the unhappy damsel lying in a perforated bed, so much consumed and grown so thin she was only skin and bone, the eyes were so deeply sunken in their orbits, that one would have needed Galileo's glasses to see the eyeballs, the nose was so sharply defined, that it might have usurped the office of the supposed form, the cheeks were so thin and drawn that they seemed like the death of Sorrento, the underlip fell back upon her chin, the breast was flat down like the breast of a magpie, the arms were like the shinbone of a lamb, bare of flesh. In brief, she was a transformed being who, with the cup of pity, drank a toast to compassion." To explain that bit about the death of Sorrento, that was a festival until 1799. Morte et Sorrento basically involved a pair of cards, each with a big puppet on the front, and at midnight they head for the town gate, where they are slain by death, and the people party on with the stuff in the carts. I think it was for the end of Lent. Mercutio feeds her the powder in a slightly warmed egg. She recovers in a way that makes sense in terms of the theory of humours. Let's take the quote. "Night had not yet entered the port and set up her tent, when the sick damsel called her handmaidens, and bade them change her bed, which was soaked in sweat. And when they had changed her, she felt refreshed, a thing that in 7 years of infirmity had never happened. And she sought somewhat of food. So they had fair hopes, and gave her something to sip. Thus every hour she gained strength, and every day her appetite increased, and not a week went by without she recovered and her health returned, and she left her bed." Seeing this, the king thought Mercutio the god of leechcraft, and endoweth him with lands and fiefs, and made him a baron and prime minister of his court, and married him to a lady of the wealthiest in that country. Note, he doesn't marry the princess. Meanwhile, the black sheep of the family has fallen on hard times. He's on the run from his problems, but they get progressively worse until he arrives at Campo penniless and ragged. It's raining, so he breaks into an abandoned shack out of town. Polomio takes off his stockings, makes a noose, and tries to hang himself. The beam is rotten, so he falls and bruises his ribs on a pile of stones that he was using as a kickstool. When the beam breaks, a thief cache is revealed. There are chains and necklaces and rings, as well as a wallet of gold ducats. He is suddenly a very happy man and heads for a tavern. In terrible luck, the thieves had stolen these exact items from this very innkeeper. What are the odds? The tavern keeper sees the wallet and has the other guys in the inn hold Palermo until he can get the watch in, and he's searched and he's carrying a ton of stolen jewellery, so it's the gibbet for him. He appeals to a high judge who happens to be his brother, and then Mercutio is struck on a dilemma, because he's caught between the demands of justice and the ties of blood. As Polomio is being led to the gibbet, a sprinting doorkeeper arrives and says, "You'll never believe this." The two thieves went back to their stash, and since it was missing, they accused each other of treachery and then stabbed each other, and then they confessed their sins, deathbed style. Mercutio explains who he is and says, "Hey, if you now know the difference between virtue and vice, come to my house, I'll share my stuff." The motto is "Virtue alone makes men blessed." Is this a story? Your saga may vary.